I decided to start just basically publishing for all of you. I did this before when I was teaching art. Basically, a lecture on the chapters. Hopefully, I'm going to get to be able to go through all of the chapters in this book. I'm looking over here because I have my little. I wanted to show you what I have. This is my office. Isn't this nice? I have my little book right here. So I'm not really an YouTube expert. So this is maybe one of my it's going to be kind of something I'm going to try to toy with as well. I'm also used to doing lecture-based classes, so I'm still getting used to the whole online thing. So the first thing I wanted to let you guys know that it's so good to have all of you. I think we have like 14 students, I believe. I need to stop saying stuff like that because I actually want to recycle some of these YouTube videos as well. So it's great to have all of you. I do want to say that it's the first week. It's a very, very fast class. It's very quick. So if you have any kind of questions, always give me a call. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about chapter one. So another reason why I wanted to give you guys some of these lectures is because with art and civilization, you could probably tell that there's a lot here. But I want to give you somewhat of a good overview so you get the best education as you possibly can. Just participate as much as you can with these discussions. What I do, the way I grade is the more information, the more more in-depth content that you actually offer, the more I'm going to give you points. The same thing with the 2-page assignments. Just make sure that you're following the directions very, very closely. I've been really impressed by some of the papers thus far, and just make sure that you do the full 2 pages, and just if you would offer as much in depth as you possibly can. Here's the thing with this class is use the book as much as you can. I notice that with a lot of students whenever I teach classes, a lot of students pressure themselves. They don't use the book. It's like they read the stuff and then they try to regurgitate something in their mind, and they have a really hard time writing. You're working too hard. It's funny. I'm a therapist by trade, and I teach listening skills to clients. And I always tell them that listening is a lot like riding a horse. And have you ever ridden a horse before? But I used to ride horses several years ago. And if you're basically with horses, if your hips are hurting, if your legs are hurting, that means you're riding the horse wrong. Riding the horse is all right here. It's just in your wrist. So if you squeeze your hips, if you actually squeeze not your hips, so you squeeze your legs and put a lot of pressure on your hips, you're doing it wrong. You're exerting way too much energy, and the horse just kind of goes its own direction, and you don't really know where it's heading. So it's the same way. It's the same thing happens when it comes to this class. Please use the book. It actually helps you, and you're gonna benefit from it very, very. You're gonna benefit a lot from it. So let's go ahead and talk about chapter one. I'm clicking out of here. So the first thing that the book talks about is it talks a little bit about Paleolithic developments. What you want to be looking for is how civilization basically started. So the authors don't apologize for how religious people have been for thousands and thousands of years. When you look at most of the pieces, looking at the abalone shell or the necklaces or the jewelry or the cave paintings, whatever you're looking at, the early writings and the early, not writings, but the artwork at that time was primarily religious. And not only was it religious, it was predominantly centered around the community. It's also predominantly centered around the family, and mainly about observing what life was really about. And even though it was very religious, one of the things, some of the earliest things that we see is basically descriptions of maybe how the people lived. So if you go all the way back to Neolithic developments as well as Paleolithic developments, we don't have a whole lot from that time. We just have a few caves like the Hall of the Bulls from figure 1.6, and then maybe the bone flute. or maybe some hand stencils from figure 1.5. So what you see here is a little bit of what the author calls foreshortening. And foreshortening is basically modeling by using grades and light to shade an illusion, as I'm just kind of reading it off the book here. But it wanted to give the family at that time a realistic picture of what was actually going on in their lives. So way back then, even though they were very religious, they just kind of wanted to observe what they were engaging. They wanted to write on what they were engaging with. They wanted to draw on what they were engaging with, and so that's what we see in the very early drawings. Slowly, though, from there, it becomes a little bit more complex. The Venus of Willendorf, I believe I'm pronouncing that right. She, you can see this little goddess statue in 1.8, is all the way back from 28,000 BC. A lot of people, you notice that the large breasts and then also the head seems to be covered, then the large belly. One thing that we could possibly learn from this is that a lot of these people had a very high view of fertility, fertility and giving birth, and woman, the female or the feminine, was in a lot of ways deified. Not so much women were deified at that time, but birth was deified, which you could probably understand why. There was a significant amount of suffering, likely a significant amount of death. The likelihood of you living past your 30th birthday was very low. So the superstition centered around the giving of life, and so we see that all the way from the first real statue. And this little Venus of Willendorf, it was found in the Valley of the Middle East. She's very, very tiny little thing, about that small. And likely this little statue was put inside somebody's house, and they would just, whether they would pray to it or they would just remember it. But you see already civilization kind of moving forward, going from just kind of pure observation, just kind of basic elementary cave paintings, to getting out a little bit more in the world, and then trying to make a little bit more sense of the complexity of what this world actually offers. And that's really the history of art, is humankind's observation on how to function, what is the point of this function, or what the point of the world is. How can we best display what our interpretation of the world, and how do we live inside it? So art is really asking these very philosophical questions that are questioning about what we observe, what we hear, what we see, what we taste, what we feel, what we're sexually attracted to, all of these things, everything that makes us really primarily human in a very somewhat chaotic world. And how do I best observe that to the spectators? And then, moving forward, we see some of the architecture gets a little bit more complex. The Neolithic period then talks a little bit about Jericho. Some of you who've been to church probably know Jericho, the story of Jericho with Joshua. He's centering around. He has a whole bunch of troops, and then God tells him to go around the city of Jericho 7 times, and then the 7th day he says to please blow the horns, and when the horns are blown, all of Jericho's walls kind of fall down. What's kind of fascinating about that story is that the book actually says that Jericho had been built several times, and that they did have very complex walls. And so what you see here is that the story of Jericho, as well as Stonehenge, is that people start making a little bit more complex architecture and walls of fortification. So you go from the cave, this little tiny weensy cave, I believe in figure 1.2, made of primarily mammoth bone, to these very strong cities in just quite a few thousand years. So what is that? It's fortifying civilization, and then you see groups of civilization becoming a lot closer, close-knit, but at the same time, somewhat of a polarization going on, groups of civilization becoming closer, but also civilization or forms of government that also contradict other forms of government, or you start working with different civilizations. So um, you start to slowly see this the form of urban life. Government becomes a little bit more complex. Government starts to get involved with more political relations, and that's where the use of writing actually starts to come in. Writing actually begins to come in when in the use of trade, in the production of goods, mainly again for the survival of that particular civilization. So writing originally, a lot of it had to do with trade, and so you wanting to move on, you could also see some of the other figurines in your book as well, in 111, 112, 113. Some of these, again, all of these seem to represent fertility. Fertility was very highly deified or even respected. I think probably respected is maybe a better word. But you could look at these four figurines right. If you look at the book with me, on, I'm assuming you're kind of looking at the book while you're watching this lecture. But notice that the composition of all the pieces, the author wants to do different things. I believe in 111, the author, or not the author, but the sculptor is emphasizing mainly the breasts and possibly a little bit of the thighs. In the second sculpture, in 112, there is no head, there are no arms, there's just what looks like the belly. And then after that, you have what looks like is actually quite a beautiful piece of work. She looks like a bird, and it's actually called Bird Lady. You have elegance and beauty. You can see and then finally after that, kind of goes from beauty to you're not really sure what you're looking at. Almost look like the sculpture just kind of took a piece of clay and just kind of stomped it down, and then just kind of made a little female figurine from that. But it's not. It's actually this last figurine is, believe it or not, the most complex of those four. It's actually trying to get a little bit more realistic to what a woman in that time. You can see the arms have more depth. You can see the shape of the legs have a little bit more detail to them. So the author is excuse me. I keep saying author. Forgive me for that. Sculptor is working more on his own composition or her composition. The other thing too, then, so the gods and goddesses begin to be introduced at this time. You don't have to necessarily know all the gods or goddesses, but they do have a lot. They have a significant influence in these ancient Near East cultures. One of the things that you need to understand about the gods is that the gods were often very distinct from the kings or the pharaohs. That's something that's going to change in a few thousands of years. So in Sumer, as well as Sumer, as well as Mesopotamia and Babylonian culture, there was usually a distinction between a god and then a king. That's eventually going to change when you get into the area of Egypt, where Egypt, you actually have a pharaoh god, and pharaoh is kind of, in a sense, deified. And you actually have this in some of the later cultures as well. But in the very beginning, believe it or not, gods were actually distinct. God's temple was, in a sense, they believed that his temple, or the gods' or goddesses' temple, were in heaven. So it's kind of like an arch like this. And then you have a ziggurat. You have a ziggurat. Forgive me if I don't pronounce all these words perfectly, which is a kind of a white temple, and they would build these temples, and they believed that the gods would then kind of like come down, and they would meet the priest right up here, and then the priests, or the votive structures, the sculptures, would then speak out to the people. And so God would then come down on these temples, and he would then speak to the priest, and this priest would basically tell other people, or the king would also represent what the god would actually be saying. So, if you come from a religious background, you could see where this kind of whole theory actually manifests itself. I believe in the Tower of Babel. So in the Tower of Babel, in Genesis chapter, Genesis chapter 6, I believe, it says in there that God looks down, he's looking, and he sees that people are actually trying to create this big tower, And the reason why people are creating a big tower is because if we create a tower, we would be able to reach all the way to the gods. And God is looking down, and he says, what are they doing down there? How, if they do this, there's nothing that they won't be able to do. And then so in the story of the Tower of Babel, God then comes down and he confuses their language. And then when he confuses their language, they can't talk anymore. And when they can't talk anymore, the tower actually stops. And so just kind of, we don't know whatever happened to it. So that's an interpretation of what may have happened. But it's using very ancient Near East language. The ancient Near East kind of had the same idea. God then kind of came down. What's going on right here? They're building an actual temple or a ziggurat to kind of reach the heavens, reach the skies. And so moving forward, you could see some of these little sculptures. It's really quite they're quite fascinating to look at. If you look at 116, see if you 2700, these are the early votive sculptures. These sculptures likely, or statues, would likely been in some of these temples. And so if you notice, these sculptures have their eyes are made of black and limestone, which could represent anywhere from not so much judgment in a harsh sense, but like I could see everything that your heart is stating. So people would often be very kind of intimidated when they go and see these sculptures or these statues, because they represented these priests that were actually in contact with the god. But again, these priests were not a god, nor were they God himself. Moving forward, then you start seeing these early forms of writing. I was just kind of saying before, writing or cuneiform is a form of writing. In the ancient Near East, it's called cuneiform. It really gets from the actually studied a little bit of Ugaritic and Akkadian in grad school because it's so relevant when you're doing marriage counseling. That was a terrible joke, but anyway, cuneiform. Just I'm a nerd. I don't have a lot. That's just what I do in my spare time. Don't ask me why. I just kind of do. Anyway, so cuneiform is an early form of writing. It was actually what it meant is wedge. It's wedge work, kind of like wedge working, wedge words. Try to say that 20 times. Wedge words, wedge words. Red leather, yellow leather. Try to say that 20 times. Anyway, so cuneiform was actually quite an advanced form of writing. So cuneiform, one of the nice things about it, it was basically using symbols. If you look at some of those, the early forms of writing, the cuneiform tablet is on the far right. So in the middle is hieroglyphics, so where the Egyptian culture would write as well. What all this writing had, one of the things it had in common is that it primarily used symbols to represent long sentences. So it wasn't like it's not like our writing where it has a lot of consonants and vowels, and it's actually more probably like Chinese. And if you ever see Chinese writing, you actually see all these. It basically is a story, so it's in the same way. I've never studied Chinese, but cuneiform was a huge advance to civilization, because it gave they would have these scribes who would use these little wedges, take this little clay tablet, and they didn't have to say a whole lot. They just had to write particular things about trade. A lot of cuneiform texts were talking about laws. Again, think about it in the religious context. You have the gods kind of coming down, and then you have the king going from that place, and then these kings would then have servants, and the servants would then have the ability to write some of these laws down, and these little tablets would then be basically given to some of the mayors of the town. So it's really kind of fascinating. So it'd be much like our president telling the senator, and the senator then telling the congressman, and the congressman then telling our own mayor kind of what the president had said. Think of it much like that way. And then one of the most famous stories of all time, so this is where you really see the advancement of civilization, and the psychological advancement of civilization. At least I should say the knowledge of the psychological knowledge of what we have about these people is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I would encourage you, if you ever get the chance, you should read. I'll be right back. if you get the chance to read the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's a fantastic, beautiful story. I have a book right here. It's translated by Stephen Mitchell, he's quite possibly one of my favorite translators. I read his Iliad and the Odyssey, and he just does a fantastic job at translating this wonderful work. Stephen Mitchell also translated the Bhagavad Gita, which is kind of like a Hindu hymn. So Stephen Mitchell, Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a short read, great read. So one of the fascinating things about the Epic of Gilgamesh that many of you have already written or will write about in your 2-page summary is that it's very in tune with life's kind of battles. It has temptation. It has sexual temptation. It has good and evil. It has nature versus nurture. It has chaos versus order. Gilgamesh is this kind of arrogant jerk, and he goes from this hubris to this very arrogant, prideful man. But the complexity, it doesn't just leave him there. It kind of assumes that he's not just an arrogant, prideful man. He works through his pride when he meets his best friend, Enkidu, and Enkidu, and then Enkidu is used by the gods to actually to humble him in his journey. That's why I wanted you to compare the Epic of Gilgamesh to Star Wars, because there's a lot of correlation to Luke and just kind of his arrogance and his pride in the very, very beginning to becoming this Jedi Master. George Lucas actually used a lot of Epic of Gilgamesh's themes to inspire his own work. So it's quite an amazing story. But what it shows us is that civilization, we can't be too prideful of our own civilization. One of the things that we often get into, and one of the reasons why I love studying art, is that we often think that just because we have technology, I have my cell phone. Here's my cell phone. Okay, I got my iPhone. Okay, and then I have an iPad, and then I haven't got the iWatch yet. I don't know if I should get it. I was thinking about it. Then we have my beautiful iComputer, or not iComputer, but so I'm a big Mac guy. I'm Mac all the way. So what's easy for us to do is to think, oh, okay, I'm technologically advanced. Therefore, this is the logical fallacy that we often run into. Therefore, it must be that I'm like somehow more intelligent than the people before me. And that's just a pure that's a fallacy. It's a fallacious error. Believe it or not, most tyrannical regimes often had the same assumption that just because I'm more advanced than my forefathers or in technology, just looking at the technology, must mean that I'm somehow more intelligent. And it's a complete fallacious. It's a fallacy. It's a total error. And that's one of the things that art actually teaches us, and not just the civilization of art, or what we're teaching, what we're going through in this class, but it tells us that there were wonderful writers and wonderful illustrators and sculptors that really understood the human psyche in a lot of ways better than we do. Epic of Gilgamesh is one of those examples. And finally, lastly, the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh is also, you have the story of the flood in there. There's debate amongst biblical scholars whether or not the flood story in the Hebrew inspired the Epic of Gilgamesh or the other way around. So if you're a little bit interested in that, I personally think it was the Epic of Gilgamesh was already known by the Hebrew writers. And the reason why I say that is because cuneiform is a much, much, much earlier form of writing than Hebrew. Hebrew was much, much, much later. Hebrew has an alphabet and has vowels and all those things. It's so much more advanced. So the writers of Genesis likely probably knew about this story of the flood, which was also inspired, not inspired, but told in this story called Epic of Gilgamesh. So you something that you can play with anyway. And then finally, it talks about Akkadian and Babylonian culture. So some of the things that you need to know here is that in when we start getting into Babylonian and Akkadian culture, this is where some of where the author starts actually now. Let's start using artistic terms here, where you start to see how the sculptors, the painters, begin to make a distinction between conceptual representation and optical representation. Now, that's going to be something that you're going to really want to know for the rest of the book. Conceptual versus optical, basically realism versus idealism. This really sets the stone. Conceptual representation is going to be when a sculptor or an artist wants to use the conception or ideal of a particular pharaoh or of a particular king, of a particular person, not so much on how he or she looked like, but what the concept was behind it. In other words, there was more of a desire to, in conceptual representation, to idealize, and that differs from optical representation, which wanted to look at how it was actually represented. So if you go to the Museum of Fine Arts, for example, you'll go to the ancient Near East room and you'll see this. You'll see quite a contrast with some of the early Egyptian statues versus the later Egyptian statues. The early Egyptian statues were very stilted. They used a lot of triangles, a lot of squares. Their heads were a little big, and their feet were humongous. So that's an example of conceptual representation. Now that's very different from what you see in Figure 1.24, where the author, the sculpture, I'm just going to keep saying author, forgive me, just go with it. But anyway, the sculpture in the Assyrian culture is using optical representation, where it's pretty much in profile. It's exactly what the king at that time likely looked like. So there are two different things going on. Usually people that want to do, usually artists that want to do, in that time, who wanted to use conceptual representation felt like kings or pharaohs were, in a sense, more important or were to be deified, that they didn't quite look like us, where people who wanted to use optical representation thought it's best to get the fairest representation. And that's just such a key distinction, because that's going to be a debate in art for thousands of years, even today. Is art more quote beautiful, or I guess not so much beautiful as much as realistic when it represents literally what it looks like, or is art a better representation when it conceptually represents what it might look like? So there's going to be a debate when we get into our later chapters, so I'm not sure how much we'll get into that. And then finally, I want to just end on Egypt. So Egypt uses a lot of conceptual representation. You can see that quite a bit on the figure 1.26. But one thing about Egypt, you really can't understand Egypt without understanding its religion. So whenever you go to the Museum of Fine Arts and you see these huge, they have this wonderful room where you can just enter, and it looks like you're right in one of the Egyptian halls. And inside the Egyptian hall, you just see all these hieroglyphics, all these little stories or registers. And registers are just basically rows, and they're all telling the story about fertility. But really, it's a constant repeat on what they viewed, on how the gods interacted with the Nile. And so there are four gods that we have to understand with Egyptian culture, and that is Osiris, and he is the god of order and structure. He's kind of the manager. And then there's the god Seth. He is the god of chaos and disorder. Think of yin and yang. And Osiris, he's a black and white guy. he's just a manager. He likes everything according to plan. My office would drive him crazy, because all of my books, even though those are according to the Library of Congress, but he would want everything perfectly organized. And if he were to enter my office right now, he would just be going nuts. And he really kind of pisses off Seth. Seth doesn't like that. Seth, he is the god of chaos. And so every single year, what goes on, according to Egyptian according to the Egyptian story, is that Osiris, he gets so stuck on order, where Seth comes along, he's another god, and says, I'm sick of it. It's time for freaking chaos, or it's time for, quote, people to get some suffering in their lives, okay? And then he just kills them, chops them, and not just like a shot, I mean, he chops them up. He literally, he gets a sword and like cuts them all over the place. I mean, it's just kind of very vivid. I'm just saying this is what they believed. And then he throws all his pieces all over the place. And then there's this goddess who comes on, and this is what she does. Her name is Isis, not like the military. In fact, there's this debate online. I have a friend who's into all these old gods, and he gets really offended when people call Isis, because he's like, well, Isis was a wonderful goddess. Why are they giving him that name? Anyway, so Isis is the female god, and she mourns. She is the goddess of mourning, and she comes in, she's crying. Every year she's crying because her, the god has been of order has been totally destroyed. She's coming in and she's picking them all up. But while she's picking them all up, she realizes that he's still dead. So what she does is that she mates. She has gathered, and it's really because Isis. The reason why she's mourning is because Osiris is Isis's sister or brother. Excuse me. She's picking up all of her brother's pieces, and so she realizes the only way for him to come back to life, the only way for order to come back to life, is that if I have to have sex with Horus, which is the sky god. And so every year she has sex with him, and then Osiris then comes back to life. Now think about that. Some of you might be like, "Oh, what's that? What's that story?" That is fascinating. Like when you really think about that. I mean, so think about the order that goes on in your life. Think about think about your own life. There's order. And what do you do whenever you feel like everything's going fine? Everything's just going great. What's the very first thought that you have? I know I can tell you my first thought. You know what I usually think? When's this shit gonna hit the fan? Right? It's usually what I'm thinking. When everything's going great, I'm waiting for the shit to hit the fan. That's usually where I'm going. And the older you get, that's actually where you go, believe it or not. Some of my students are I know some of you are in their 30s and 40s, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you are, I'm not picking on some of you who are really a whole lot younger than I am, but you'll get this. Right when you turn 30, 35, 40, 50, especially when you talk to people who are a lot older, they get this very, very well. Things are going well, but they're very attuned to just here and now, in the present moment. Why? Because they know that the shit's going to hit the fan, the stuff's going to hit the fan, and then what's going to happen? Everything's going to fall apart, and that's Seth, right? Because eventually Seth comes in and destroys that, and cuts it, and not just destroys it. Have you ever noticed that when stuff hits the fan, you ever notice that when like a friend, if any of you who have had like maybe a friend or parent or loved one pass away, do you ever notice that it's not just them who pass away? It's like your other best friend passes away and your other sibling also. I mean, it just like it goes down the list. I have clients who go through grief. It's like they'll have like their parent that dies, and then next year their brother will die, and then their other brother will die. I mean, it's just like bam, 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 bam. It's not just one little thing. Like when the crap hits the fan, it just goes down. That's Seth. It's cutting it all that order to pieces. And then what is the only way to actually help you get through that? You have to properly grieve. And that's where Isis comes in. You have to properly grieve. And you come in there and you grieve the loss and you let go. And this is what Buddhists often talk about. The Buddhists talk about life is suffering. That's their first premise. Life is suffering. Why is there suffering? It's because there's attachment. There's attachment. And you're too attached. And you have to let go of that attachment. And it's the same kind of concept. Is that Isis comes along. The only way you can, quote, move on from this grief is that there has to be mourning. There has to be mourning. Now, her mating, it's not so much in sexual terms as much as regeneration and renewal, going back to what we thought about before, which is the point of all of it. That little statue of Venus of Willendorf is fertility. It's life. It's rebirth. And so when a family is going through grief, say, for example, a family loses a parent and a sister and all those other things, what's the one thing that usually brings them together right after grief? The birth of a loved one. the birth of a child, the birth of a French child. There's birth, right? And so it's, so the Egyptians, as much as we can, you could look at all these stories, you're like, oh, that's old fashioned. They're extremely psychological. They really understood how we worked and how we functioned. And that's just really amazing, is because they put all these things in registers and they told these amazing stories and using hieroglyphics. And it was all explaining when people would come in from the marketplace, the writing was really there to bring them together. And not just to bring them together, but to teach them that I understand you. And this is why you need to listen to Pharaoh. It's not just that Pharaoh is just this God telling you all what to do. Pharaoh understands you, and that's the whole point. That's one of the reasons why Egyptian culture lasted for so long, is because it was not just it was psychologically relevant to a lot of the people. So one little thing. I think that's pretty much it that I wanted to kind of cover here. So you could look at the colonnades, and it just kind of repeats from that. But I wanted to kind of focus on the philosophy and how this philosophy is being interpreted, how it's being used a lot, quite a bit through art. And that's one of the exciting things that we'll be talking about in this class, is that the ideas of the age, or the philosophies of the age, are always best represented by the best artists, and the artists that have lasted all these thousands of years. We can go back and we can look at these pieces and these wonderful works, and we can get a sense of what these people actually thought, and then learn from them on what we can learn, on what we can take away as well. So I'm really excited about this class. I wanted to keep these lectures kind of short because I know you guys have tons of work. I could keep going, but I'm going to stop there, and let me know if you guys have any questions. Thanks.